She almost didn't go into the restaurant that night. The rain had been falling since early afternoon, the kind of steady, cold October rain that soaks through everything and makes the whole world feel gray and tired. Elena Marchetti stood under the narrow awning of a dry cleaner 2 blocks from her apartment, her umbrella turned inside out by the wind, her coat already clinging to her shoulders, and she had precisely 2 options. She could keep walking home through the rain, eat whatever sad combination of leftovers was in her refrigerator, and spend another evening alone in her apartment pretending she wasn't lonely. Or she could duck into the warm light spilling out through the foggy window of Trattoria Serrano, the little Italian place on the corner of Whitmore and Fifth that she had walked past at least 100 times and never once entered. She chose the restaurant. She would think about that choice many times in the months that followed. She would think about how different everything would have been if the rain hadn't come, if her umbrella hadn't broken, if she had simply kept walking. She would turn that small, ordinary moment over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight, wondering how something so unremarkable could have changed the entire course of your life. But that was later. In the moment, she was just cold and wet and hungry, and the restaurant looked warm. The bell above the door rang softly when she pushed inside. The space was small and crowded, all dark wood and amber light, candles on the tables, the smell of garlic and red wine thick in the air. A young woman in a black apron looked up from behind the host stand with the practiced smile of someone who had worked dinner service long enough to greet anyone warmly regardless of how they looked, and Elena, standing there dripping onto the mat with her destroyed umbrella folded under her arm, probably looked fairly terrible. "Do you have a reservation?" No, she didn't. "Walk-ins only at the bar tonight, I'm afraid." The young woman gestured toward the long wooden bar that ran the length of the far wall. Elena looked at the bar. A few stools were occupied, men and women in suits mostly, the after-work crowd unwinding over glasses of wine. The seat at the far end was empty. "That'll be fine," Elena said. She settled onto the stool, propped her broken umbrella against the brass footrail, and picked up the laminated drink menu, without really reading it. The bartender, a young man with dark eyes and an easy manner, came over and she ordered a glass of Barolo without looking up because she had already decided she needed red wine, and she needed it immediately. It came quickly. She wrapped both hands around the stem of the glass, let the warmth of the room start to work through the chill in her bones, and finally began to feel like herself again. Elena Marchetti, 31 years old, junior architect at a firm that didn't know what to do with her, occupant of a 1-bedroom apartment that cost too much and rewarded her with a partial view of a parking garage. She was not unhappy exactly, but she was not happy in any of the ways she had imagined she would be at this point in her life, and the gap between imagined happiness and actual happiness had grown wide enough in the last year that she had started noticing it the way you notice a draft in a room, always there, always cold, always making itself known at the worst possible moments. She was on her second glass of wine and working through a small plate of olives when a man sat down next to her. She didn't look at him at first. There were no other empty seats at the bar by then, and she had been aware for the last 10 minutes of someone standing behind her waiting, so his arrival was not a surprise. She moved her coat to make a little more room and kept her attention on the small notebook she had pulled from her bag, the one where she sketched building details when her mind needed something to do with itself. She was halfway through a quick drawing of the window frame across the room when he spoke. "Is that the Serrano building on Allandair Street?" She looked up. The man beside her was looking at her notebook, not intrusively, not leaning over, just a quick glance that had apparently caught enough of what she was drawing for him to recognize it. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired, with a kind of face that was too composed to be casually handsome, more like carefully assembled, every feature deliberate. He was wearing a dark suit without a tie, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat, and he had the bearing of someone who occupied every room he entered with complete confidence and did not need to announce it. Elena looked back at her sketch. The Serrano building. She had been drawing the distinctive arched window detail from memory, without entirely realizing it. She paused. "I didn't know anyone still called it that." The man's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted in it, a small movement of interest. "My grandfather used to take me past it when I was a boy. He always called it the Serrano building. I never knew it by any other name." He looked at her notebook again. "You're an architect?" Something in his directness struck her, not rude, just certain, like a man who asked the questions he wanted answered, and assumed he would receive answers without having to coax them out. "I work at Harmon and Associates," she said. She didn't know why she gave him the firm's name. She never usually did. "I do mostly restoration work. Historic buildings." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "The Serrano building needs it. The southeast facade has been deteriorating for at least a decade. Nobody seems to care." "Are you in real estate?" "Something like that." He said it the way people say something like that when they mean considerably more than that, but have no particular interest in explaining further at this moment. Elena had met enough people in the construction and development world to know the particular texture of that deflection. She didn't push it. They ate dinner side by side at the bar. It was not a planned thing, not exactly. The bartender took their orders within a few minutes of each other, and the food arrived at nearly the same time, and it would have been more awkward not to acknowledge the parallel than to simply exist in proximity with a degree of normalcy. They talked the way strangers sometimes do when circumstances have placed them together, and there is nothing particularly threatening about the situation. Easily, in the comfortable gaps between bites and sips of wine, letting the conversation find its own shape. His name was Luca Ferrante. He had been in the city for 3 years after spending most of his adult life between Chicago and Milan. He had an opinion about the city's architecture that was detailed enough to be professional and personal enough to be genuine. He knew the names of buildings she mentioned before she finished saying them, and could place them by decade and architect with a kind of fluency that came from either careful study or a very long time spent paying attention to the physical world around him. She told him about her work on the Aldrich Hotel restoration, the ongoing nightmare trying to match a specific plaster formulation that had not been commercially produced since 1978. He listened with his full attention in a way that felt unusual enough to notice, not nodding along waiting for his turn to speak, but actually listening, following the details, asking a question at exactly the right moment that told her he had understood everything she'd said. By the time she finished her coffee, she had been in the restaurant for 2.5 hours, and the rain had stopped outside, and the dinner crowd had thinned, and she had no real reason left to stay. She gathered her coat and her ruined umbrella and her notebook. He was already standing, having signaled for the check several minutes earlier, without making production of it, and the bill appeared to have been handled, which she only fully understood when she looked at her own check and found it missing. She turned to object and found him already with his coat on, completely unruffled, as though paying for a stranger's dinner at a bar was simply something that happened. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." His tone was pleasant, matter of fact. "Have a safe walk home. Elena." She walked out into the clean, cold air of the street after the rain and stood for a moment under the awning trying to identify what she was feeling. It was not the dizzy flutter of a crush exactly, though she would have been lying to herself if she claimed there was nothing. It was more like the sensation of having been seen by someone with very good eyes, which was both flattering and faintly unsettling, the way any honest appraisal is. She walked home. She thought about him on and off for the rest of the week the way you think about something you can't quite categorize, returning to it briefly, and then setting aside, because there is nothing practical to do with it. She did not expect to see him again. She was wrong. The second time she ran into Luca Ferrante was 2 weeks later at the city planning office, which had no business being the setting for a second encounter between two people, but apparently had decided to be anyway. Elena was there for a permit review on a restoration project, standing in a line that was moving with the particular glacial slowness of all government lines everywhere, holding a folder of documents against her chest, and staring at nothing with the blank patience of someone who has learned not to fight the bureaucratic inertia of mid-morning Tuesdays. He was coming out of an office at the far end of the corridor when she saw him. A city official was beside him, shaking his hand with the deference of someone trying to make a good impression on someone who does not particularly need it. Luca was listening to whatever the man was saying with polite attention, and nodding in the way of a person who has somewhere else to be but will not be rude about leaving. He saw her across the room at almost exactly the moment she saw him. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds where neither of them moved. Then the corners of his mouth moved in that composed, almost smile, and he said something brief to the official beside him and crossed the room. Elena stood in her line and felt a very specific kind of absurdity about standing in a government permit line while a man like Luca Ferrante walked toward her. Trattoria Serrano must have better service than I realized, he said when he reached her. She laughed despite herself. I'm here for a permit. You? He glanced back at the corridor he'd come from. Business. He looked at the folder in her arms. The Aldrich? No, a warehouse conversion on the east side. She lifted the folder slightly. Residential. The client wants to preserve the original brick, and I need sign-off on the structural approach. He was looking at her with that same quality of focused attention she'd noticed the first night, unhurried, thorough. I'm having dinner tonight, he said, at Caruso's on Meridian. Will you join me? It was not quite a question, not exactly a command either. It landed somewhere in between, in the particular register of a man who asked for what he wanted directly and left the actual decision entirely in the other person's hands. Elena looked at him. She knew perfectly well she was going to say yes. She also knew that saying yes was not entirely without consequence, though she could not have articulated at that point precisely what the consequence would be. 7 o'clock, she said. He nodded, as if this was what he had expected. His phone was already in his hand as he walked away, a brief, purposeful movement back toward the exit, and she watched him go for a moment before the line shuffled forward, and the city official behind the glass called next, and she had to return her attention to permits and plaster formulations and the practical world. Caruso's on Meridian was not the kind of restaurant you went to without a reservation. Elena had been in the city long enough to know the name, even if she had never been inside. It occupied the ground floor of a converted brownstone, white tablecloths, no menu prices, the kind of place where the staff knew returning guests by name and remembered how they took their coffee. She had passed it before on the way to other places and clocked it as somewhere she would probably never actually go. Too expensive, too formal. And there was no occasion in her life that had risen to that particular level. She had dressed carefully without letting herself admit she was being careful about it. A deep green dress she had worn to exactly 2 work functions and 1 gallery opening, her dark hair down, low heels. She arrived at 7 and was shown immediately to a table near the window, a small reserve card already removed, Luca already seated, which many had arrived before her, which she found she noted without quite being able to say why it mattered. He stood when she reached the table. It was not a performative gesture. It was simply what he did. They spent 3 hours at that table. It was the first time she really talked to him, not the easy surface talk of 2 strangers sharing a bar on a rainy night, but the real kind, the kind that cost something. He asked her about her work and actually wanted to know, not the polite, interested face people perform when they ask about your job, but genuine curiosity, following threads, asking why and then asking why again. He asked her about the buildings she loved, not just professionally but personally, which ones had stopped her on the sidewalk and made her feel something she couldn't immediately name. She told him about a crumbling textile mill outside the city that she had driven out to see alone on a Sunday 2 years ago and stood in front of for nearly an hour just looking at it, feeling the weight of all the years it had survived and all the years it wouldn't. And she had not told anyone that story before, because it had always seemed too private, too much like confessing something. He listened without performing a reaction. Then he said, "The building will outlast most of the things built this decade. I can tell you that much." She looked at him. "You know it?" He paused. "My family owns the property." There was a beat of silence. He looked at her steadily during it, neither apologetic nor evasive, just honest in that particular direct way of his, waiting for her to land wherever she was going to land. "What kind of business exactly are you in?" she asked, and she meant it as a real question this time, not the passing curiosity she had felt at the bar. His eyes were very dark in the candlelight. "The family business," he said. "Real estate, construction, certain other interests. My grandfather built the first warehouse on the South River docks. My father expanded it considerably. I managed what they built." Elena thought about the city official who had been shaking his hand that morning. She thought about the ease with which he'd been given a table at a restaurant where reservations were routinely refused. She thought about the way the sommelier had arrived at their table, without being called, and placed a bottle of wine she had not seen on any menu with a quiet nod, as though this was not the kind of thing that needed discussing. She had grown up in this city. She understood, what certain kinds of names meant. She understood the particular grammar of wealth that had history attached to it, the kind that was older than its current occupant and would outlast him too. She did not ask a more specific question than the one she had asked, and he did not volunteer more than he had offered. They finished dinner. He drove her home in a black car with a driver she did not comment on, and when they pulled up in front of her building, she turned to say goodnight. And he looked at her for a moment with something steady and serious in his expression. "I'd like to see you again," he said. Simple, direct, waiting. She thought about the textile mill. She thought about standing in front of something old and complicated and beautiful, and feeling the particular weight of knowing it was not uncomplicated, and choosing to keep looking at it anyway. "All right," she said. She went inside and pressed the elevator button and stood in the mirrored lobby watching the doors close with the feeling of a woman who has made a decision she cannot entirely account for and is not entirely sure she should. 3 weeks later, she was in love with him. She did not plan it. She would not have chosen it if planning had been available to her. Love was not something Elena did easily or quickly. She was the kind of person who took her time making any important decision, who read the fine print and thought about the implications and kept her own counsel until she was sure. She had been engaged once, for years earlier, to a man named David who was kind and decent and deeply wrong for her in ways neither of them had understood until the engagement was 6 months old and the wrongness had become undeniable. She had ended it carefully and as gently as she could, and had carried the guilt of having hurt someone who did not deserve it for a long time afterward. She was not a person who fell quickly. But Luca Ferrante had a way of paying attention to the world around him that made the world feel more vivid and more worth noticing. And being the person he was paying attention to was a particular kind of intoxication she had no existing defenses against. He took her to see buildings. That was the thing that got her. Not just dinners, not just the beautiful restaurants and the ease of a life that moved through the world without friction, though all of that was present. He took her, on a Saturday afternoon in November with the cold already settling into the city, to a 19th century marble bank on the east side that was being slowly gutted by a developer. He had gotten keys from somewhere she did not ask about. They walked through the empty, echoing rooms in the thin winter light, and she ran her hands along the original wainscoting and felt the particular grief she always felt at seeing old things disappear. And he stood beside her and said nothing because he understood that sometimes nothing was the right thing to say. He had seen what mattered to her, and he had brought her directly to the center of it. She understood that this was not accidental. She understood that Luca Ferrante did very few things accidentally. Her friend Claudia, who was practical in a way that only truly good friends allow themselves to be, sat across from Elena at brunch in December and said, "Tell me about the family." Elena looked at her coffee. Claudia raised her eyebrows. "The Ferrante family. I've heard the name. My father used to mention it when I was growing up. What exactly is the nature of his family's business?" Elena set down her cup. "He manages the family's holdings. Real estate, construction." Claudia looked at her with the expression of a woman who has not survived 35 years in the city by being credulous. And Elena said carefully, "They have a significant amount of influence in certain circles." Significant influence. Claudia repeated it back to her. "Elena, I need you to hear me asking you directly. Who is this man?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "He is the most honest person I have ever spent time with. He has never told me anything that turned out to be false. He has never made me a promise he didn't keep. And he looks at me like I am the only thing in the room worth looking at." Claudia was quiet. That is a very specific answer to a very general question. "I know. Elena, are you safe?" She thought about that question seriously. She turned it over in her mind the way she had turned every stone of this particular situation over in her mind for the past month. She thought about the driver, the men who occupied the outer edges of every room Luca moved through without calling attention to themselves. She thought about the phone calls he sometimes stepped away to take, the brief efficient conversations conducted in a low voice that he never explained and she never asked about. She thought about the way people received him in every space he entered, the deference that was not exactly fear, but was not unrelated to it either. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am." Claudia looked at her for a long moment. "All right," she said finally, "but promise me you'll tell me if anything changes." I promise. She did not tell Claudia that she had already seen, on a night 3 weeks earlier, something that had answered all the questions she had been carrying. She had been at Luca's apartment, a sprawling top-floor space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the river, and she had come out of the kitchen with 2 glasses of wine, to find him standing at the window on the phone, his back to her. The conversation had been in Italian, which she did not speak, but the tone had been unmistakable, low, controlled, utterly certain. The tone of a man issuing a directive to someone who would not fail to follow it. He had ended the call and turned and seen her standing there with the wine glasses, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition, complete and mutual. She set the glasses down on the coffee table. She sat on the sofa. He crossed the room and sat beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You know what my family is," he said. Not a question. She met his eyes. "I've known for a while." He looked at her steadily. "And?" She picked up her wine glass. "And I'm still here." His hand came to rest over hers on the cushion between them, covering it completely. And he was quiet for a moment in the way. He was quiet sometimes when something mattered to him more than he intended to show. "I need you to understand something," he said. "There are things about my life that carry risk. Not for you. I protect what is mine. But I need you to understand that stepping closer to me means stepping into something that does not step away from you afterward." Elena looked at his hand over hers. She thought of the marble bank, the empty echoing rooms, the cold winter light. She thought of the textile mill on a Sunday morning, the weight of old things, the particular beauty of structures built to last. "I understand," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, a gesture so quiet and deliberate it undid her completely, and she thought that whatever came next, she would not regret this particular decision. Some things were simply worth the weight of them. The holidays came. Elena met his mother on a Sunday evening in mid-December, which was either 4 weeks too soon or exactly the right moment depending on how you measured these things. Lucia Ferrante was a small, precise woman in her late 60s with sharp dark eyes that saw everything in gray-streaked hair pulled back from a face that must have been spectacular in her youth and was still remarkable now. She had been born in Palermo and had come to America as a young woman with her husband and 2 small children, and had built a life in this city with the efficient deliberateness of someone who understood that survival required both intelligence and will. She spoke English with an accent she had never tried to lose because she saw no reason to, and she looked at Elena across the dining table in Luca's apartment with an assessment that was direct enough to be slightly unnerving and warm enough to be exactly the opposite of hostile. "You're the architect," she said. "Yes." "Luca says you restore old buildings. Historic properties. Yes. I try to preserve the original structure wherever the budget allows." His mother considered her. "People tear down too many things. They don't understand that what is old is not useless, just different." Elena looked at her. "That's exactly what I believe." Something shifted in Lucia's expression. "Good." She turned to her son. "She knows what she's talking about." Luca met Elena's eyes across the table with something that might have been amusement in another man's face, but was more like quiet satisfaction in his. He had the look of someone who had expected a particular outcome and received it. His sister Ginevra was less measured. Ginevra was 28, arrived late with her coat still on and a glass of her brother's wine in her hand before she had fully crossed the threshold, assessed Elena in approximately 4 seconds, and announced that Elena's boots were excellent and she wanted to know where they were from. The conversation that followed was entirely different in character from the one with Lucia, but no less consequential, because Ginevra's directness was its own kind of intelligence, and she asked questions in the middle of casual conversation that were anything but casual. By the time the evening was over, Elena had been examined from 3 different angles by 3 people who loved Luca Ferrante and had a significant stake in who he chose to let into his life, and she had come through it with a particular feeling of having passed the test without ever quite understanding all the questions. Driving home that night, she sat in the back of the car and stared at the lights moving past the window and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the sensation of fitting somewhere, of matching to a specific set of people in a specific way. She pressed her fingers against the cold window glass. She thought, "I'm going to love this family." And the thought frightened her and did not frighten her in almost equal measure. January came, and with it the first real difficulty. She had been aware for some time that Luca's world had layers she did not have access to. She was not naive about what that meant. She did not ask, and he did not offer, and the arrangement had felt like a reasonable one. Two adults acknowledging the reality of the situation and choosing to proceed within it. She trusted him. That trust had been built slowly and on evidence. The kept promises, the honesty, the quality of his attention to everything that mattered. To her, she was not operating on hope or on intoxication of early feeling. She was operating on a record. And then a man named Silvio Catano came back to the city. She learned about it the way she learned about most things in Luca's world. Not from him directly, but from the shape of his absence, the quality of his distraction, the way the phone calls came more frequently, and he stepped away for them with particular tightness in his jaw that she had not seen before. She did not ask, but she noticed the night. He came home at 2 a.m. to find her awake on his sofa, with her laptop and a half-finished cup of tea gone cold. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression that made her set the laptop down. He sat beside her, not touching her, just beside her. There's a situation, he said, an older conflict, a man who has reasons to want things in the city to move in a direction that would cost my family considerably. She looked at his hands on his knees. Is anyone in danger? There was a pause that lasted precisely 1 second too long. We are managing it, he said. Luca, he turned to look at her directly. I need you to trust me to handle this in the way I know how to handle it. And I need you to understand that there will be certain things I cannot explain to you in detail. Elena held his gaze. I trust you, but I need to know if I need to be worried about you specifically. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have survived considerably worse than Silvio Catano. His mouth curved barely. And I have significantly more to protect now than I did the last time he tried something. She understood the second sentence. She understood that it meant her, and that it was not a performance but an actual articulation of how he calculated risk. And the knowledge of that sat in her chest with a weight that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unwelcome. She leaned into him. He put his arm around her, and they sat like that without speaking until she fell asleep there on the sofa, which was not how she had planned the evening, and was in some ways more intimate than anything planned could have been. The situation with Catano lasted 6 weeks, and resolved in a way she never fully understood and never asked about. What she understood was that it resolved. What she observed was that in the aftermath of it, something in Luca settled, a tension that had been present since January, released in the way a rope releases when the pressure is relieved. And he came home one evening in late February with a bottle of Barolo that she recognized as the very expensive kind, and said, It's over. She poured 2 glasses. They sat by the window with the city below them, and she thought about 6 weeks of sleeping with the lights on in her own apartment and pretending she wasn't doing it because she was anxious. She thought about the particular discipline of trusting someone else's judgment in an area where you have no expertise and very little information. She thought about what it meant to love someone whose life was not simple. I spent a lot of time this winter being scared, she said. He looked at her. Not scared of you, she clarified. Scared of losing you. Those are different things. His jaw moved. Yes. She turned her wine glass in her hand. I need you to know that I am fully in this. I'm not here because I'm hoping things will simplify. I'm not here waiting for you to become someone with a different kind of life. I am here because of who you are and what your life actually is, and I have made my decision with that understanding. He set down his glass and turned to face her, and there was something in his expression that was stripped of all the control he usually maintained so carefully, something plain and true without the composed surface he presented to the world. I have loved you since the night you told me about the textile mill, he said. I have not said it until now, because I needed you to understand what you were choosing before I said it. Elena looked at him. I've known for a while, she said. I was waiting for you to catch up. His laugh was quiet and real, and she had never loved the sound of something so much in her life. Spring arrived. Elena spent a Sunday afternoon at his family's house in April, the big stone house on the river that Luca's grandfather had built in 1951, and that had belonged to successive generations of Ferrantes ever since. The garden was still winter bare, but the forsythia was beginning to open along the south wall, yellow against old stone, and Lucille was in the kitchen making something that smelled of tomato and basil and thyme, and Ginevra had commandeered the dining table for some project involving fabric swatches that she periodically consulted at volume, and then abandoned in favor of more wine. And there were cousins Elena was still learning to sort by name, and a dog of uncertain breed, and excellent manners. And Lucas sitting beside her in the garden with his jacket off and his face turned up to the early sun with an openness she only ever saw in him here, in this house, with these people. She watched him, he had told her once, in November, standing in the empty marble bank with the cold coming through the broken windows, that the hardest thing about his life was holding the weight of what he was responsible for. The people, the business, the history, the expectations. He had said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things that cost him something, without drama, but she had heard the actual weight in it. She put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the garden chair. He turned his head and looked at her. She thought about the rain in October, the broken umbrella and the warm light in the window, and the entirely ordinary decision to go inside. She thought about how the whole shape of your life could turn on something that small. She smiled at him. The dinner that changed everything happened in May. They had been together 8 months, which was long enough that she had a drawer at his apartment, and he knew where she kept her spare key. When his cousin Marco came to the city with news that required the kind of family conversation that happened at a specific hour at a specific table with the door closed. Luca told her before he told anyone else. They were in the kitchen of his apartment, her at the counter with a cup of coffee and him standing at the window with his back to the room in the way he stood when he was thinking through something serious, and he turned and said, "Marco has information about a move against the Southern Territory. Someone is trying to consolidate what we have. It would require a response." She set down her cup. He turned and looked at her with the full weight of his attention. "I'm telling you because I will not ask you to be in my life and keep things from you that affect it." "What kind of response?" she said, and the question caused her something to ask, because she understood that the answer might be the kind of thing she could not come back from easily. He held her gaze. "The kind that protects what belongs to us." She sat with that for a moment. She had known from the beginning what his life was. She had told him in February that she was fully in it. She had made that decision with her eyes open and her mind clear. She was not a woman who made decisions and then revisited them when they became uncomfortable. But love, she understood now, was not a decision you made once. It was a decision you made again and again, each time new information arrived, each time the thing you had chosen revealed another layer of its actual self. She looked at the man standing at the window of his apartment with the city behind him and the morning light on his face and the weight of his family's world on his shoulders, the man who had taken her to empty buildings and listened to her talk about plaster formulations and pressed his mouth against her knuckles with a quiet deliberateness that had undone her. The man who had waited to say "I love you" until she had enough information to know what she was accepting when she said it back. She stood up. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. She put her hand flat against his chest. "Handle it," she said. Something in his face moved. "And come back." He covered her hand with his, pressed it there over his heart with a certainty that felt like gravity. "Always," he said. She believed him. The situation resolved in 3 weeks. She did not ask the details, and he did not offer them. And the arrangement held because it was built on something honest, a shared understanding of what each of them was and what each of them needed and what they were each prepared to accept. When he came home on a Tuesday night at the end of the 3rd week and walked through the door without the tightness in his jaw she had been watching for, she was already at the stove with dinner most of the way finished and a glass of Merlot open on the counter. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She looked back. He crossed the room and kissed her temple, her cheek, the corner of her mouth, with the particular careful thoroughness of a man returning to something he was profoundly relieved to return to, and she turned off the stove because dinner could wait. June arrived brilliant and warm. Ginevra pulled her aside on a Sunday afternoon in the garden and said, with all of her characteristic directness and none of its usual levity, "He hasn't been this way before. I need you to understand that I don't say that lightly. He has been careful his whole life. Careful in a way that people are careful when they have too much to lose if they are careless. And he has made that his whole way of being in the world. And then you," she paused, "take care of him." Elena looked at her. "I intend to." Ginevra studied her for a moment and then nodded once. Sharply, the way you nod when you have received exactly the answer you were hoping for. They had dinner that night, all of them, at the long stone table in the garden that Lucia had been setting on summer evenings since Luca was a child. The light strung over the arbor, the smell of the river, the wine and the food, and the noise of people who had known each other so long that silence was as comfortable as conversation. Elena sat between Luca and his youngest cousin and ate and talked and listened to Ginevra argue with Marco about something she entirely lost the thread of after the second glass of wine, and she looked around the table at all of these complicated, difficult, extraordinary people who had somehow become hers, and she thought, with a clarity she hadn't felt about anything in a very long time, that she was exactly where she wanted to be. Luca found her hand under the table. He did not make a thing of it. He simply held it, the way he did most things that mattered to him, steadily, without drama, with complete intention. She held it back. He asked her to marry him in July. They were at the textile mill, the one outside the city, the one she had driven out to alone on that Sunday 2 years ago, and stood in front of for nearly an hour, not knowing that it belonged to the Ferrante family, not knowing that the man she would love had grown up hearing about this building from the same grandfather who called it by its old name. The mill was being restored now. She knew this because she was the architect on the project, which Luca had arranged with a directness that bordered on the audacious, and which he had accepted after the appropriate professional negotiation, because the building deserved a good restoration, and she was the right person for it. They were walking to the ground floor in the late afternoon light, the old brick exposed now, the structural work well underway, and she was explaining what would happen to the east wall, and he was listening in that way of his, and she turned to point at something in the ceiling structure, and he was standing very still in the golden light, and looking at her with something in his expression that stopped the words in her throat. He reached into the pocket of his jacket. The ring was his grandmother's, small and old and perfect, a sapphire set in rose gold, not a declaration of expenditure, a declaration of lineage. He said, "I want you beside me for the rest of my life. All of it, not the version of it that is easy to explain. Everything." She looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at the old brick walls around them, the building that had survived decades waiting to be restored. She thought about the rain in October. She thought about how the whole shape of your life could turn on something as small as a broken umbrella. She held out her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger and looked at it there for a moment before he looked at her. And when he looked at her, his eyes were dark and certain and entirely unguarded in a way she had learned to understand meant something it would have cost him to show to anyone else. She stepped into him. He held her there in the dusty golden light of the building she was going to spend the next year bringing back to itself. And she thought that this was what restoration actually meant, not just buildings but people, the careful, deliberate work of returning something to what it was always meant to be. Outside the windows, the summer light was fading over the city. Inside, there was warmth enough. If you have been watching until this moment, you already know that the best stories are never really about the extraordinary things. They are about the rain on an October evening and a broken umbrella and the warm light in a window and the decision, small and ordinary and entirely consequential, to go inside. Leave your thoughts below. And if you are new here, subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from.